It's a real honor to talk about this wonderful work. It is usually referred to as late Mozart because it is one of the two last operas he wrote. Magic Flute and La Clemenza di Tito dovetailed so closely that it's difficult to know when he put the finishing touches on either of them, but he did before they premiered. And excuse me, Brenna Corner, our artistic director, put it, I think, rather well when she said that really this feels like middle Mozart. It feels like it's giving an idea where Mozart's compositional path might have started to go. It's quite an unusual work, and historically it's quite unusual because it represents a genre of music drama that was pretty much dead by the time Mozart arrived in Vienna to live there in 1781. But he really infuses new life into this old genre rather unexpectedly. So a little bit about the year, 1791, Mozart's last year, and the summer. Now, how many of you have learned things about Mozart in music appreciation classes just during the course of your listening life? We all know a lot about Mozart, except almost all of it seems to have been debunked as mythology. There is no composer, I think, who's so shrouded in mythology than Mozart is, beginning with his position within the musical community of Vienna. It's true that he was part of a community. There was a very thriving community of professionals working in the field of Italian opera. That was like one of their main public entertainments. So there was a lot of jostling for position, competing for jobs, etc. There was intrigue. So certainly Mozart had excited a certain amount of jealousy amongst his peers, but also he was very admired by them. And one of the people who sort of combined aspects of both those sides of rivalry was Antonio Salieri. How many of you have heard, how many of you saw that movie? Okay. So I just want to let you know that Antonio Salieri was actually a very, what would we say, accomplished composer, perhaps not touched with the genius of Mozart, otherwise we'd still be performing his works. But he was a highly respected professional and very successful in terms of monetary gain. One of the things did you know, for example, that he was a teacher of Schubert, Salieri, or that Beethoven dedicated works to him? So that says something about his position. But I will tell you something he did not do. He did not poison Mozart. He had nothing whatsoever to do with Mozart's death. And this is the first of the myths that I want to just bring to your attention. People began writing things and commenting things. Mozart became everybody's best friend after his death, and everybody wanted to be associated with him in some ways. And if everybody who claimed to have been in his room when he died was actually there, he would have had to die in Madison Square Gardens. So, and from that we get all sorts of these interesting comments about him, his wife, his works, his associates and contemporaries, and some of that bears a close relationship with La Clemenza di Tito, which is why I'm bringing it up. So we also learned that Mozart he left debts, and his widow had to settle them and had to accumulate enough wealth as quickly as possible to support herself and their two surviving children. Now, people often assume that they were both bad money managers, etc. And Mozart didn't concern himself too much with the management of money. He liked to live well, he liked to wear fancy clothes, etc. But when we look at the situation, we should balance it with what we would have today and ask ourselves if any couple in their early 30s with 2 kids is absolutely free of credit card debt. So the only thing is Mozart didn't have access to Visa or MasterCard. So in any case, this work was also brought into the world at a time when there was a certain amount of friction between Austria and Turkey. And so many of Mozart's supporters were not on hand. So I will leave that topic now. But just to let you know, Mozart had actually quite a successful 1791. And around the time he was writing Flute, he was given that famous commission that came from a mysterious emissary of Count Walsegg to write a requiem to be performed at a memorial service for the Count's late wife. But it was to be done in secret because the Count was prone to presenting these works of music and telling the audience that he wrote them. There's so many weird people up in that higher echelon of society. Anyway, so Mozart couldn't resist the high fee. He needed it. And then at almost the same time, this commission came in for La Clemenza di Tito, and it's an interesting story all by itself. It was to be performed at the coronation of Emperor Leopold II in Prague, making him effectively King of Bohemia. So that's a big deal. And the commission was sent to a number of other composers, but importantly, it was sent to Antonio Salieri, who turned it down because he said there simply wasn't enough time. Now, everybody knew Mozart could work very quickly, so Mozart accepted the commission because, again, it was a very high fee. But it meant that he was going to be extremely busy with the Magic Flute, with the Requiem, and with this opera, La Clemenza di Tito. So he was working on two things at the same time. The Magic Flute premiered on September 29th, 1791. Mozart died early in December that same year. La Clemenza di Tito premiered at the coronation on September 6th, 1791. So we had these two massive operas that were first performed within weeks of one another in two very prominent places. So I want to talk about what La Clemenza di Tito actually is. It is what we would call an opera seria. Now, in terms of the genres cultivated by Mozart, we have opera buffa, and we've all seen the masterpieces that he produced: Don Giovanni, La Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte. And we've done them quite a lot here in Pacific Opera. This is the first time we've ever done La Clemenza di Tito. And I will ask this question very quickly. How many of you have actually had a chance to see Clemenza live before? Yes. Well, it's your favorite Mozart opera, isn't it? Yes. Not many people. Now, I'll ask you, how many people have seen The Marriage of Figaro live? Yes, that's generally what we will encounter because we have it, we perform it a lot. So this is, as I said, an opera seria. There's one other genre I should bring to your attention, and that is the Singspiel, which is what the Magic Flute is, a German language musical with dialogue. And I think it's important to point out that the Magic Flute was presented in what we might consider the equivalent of a Broadway theater. So it was appealing to a whole different audience than, say, Figaro had earlier, and definitely than any opera seria would. The opera seria usually is meant to entertain and in some ways to flatter the aristocracy or the royal. It's generally performed for them. It generally presents the story, a historical story that's tweaked, of course, that features an emperor or a king. Very, very few empresses and queens are at the center of the stories, but there's every now and again is one. But this is an emperor. And the emperor is presented to be the bravest and the most heroic in battle, but also magnanimous and humane and benevolent. In other words, perfect. And this is presented for the ruling emperor or king as a sort of picture of how this ruler is meant to behave, to flatter him. Also, perhaps in some cases, and I believe Clemenza is one of them, the intention to just sort of remind him how important it is to be kind and understanding to your subjects. Remember, 1791 wasn't so nice in Paris, so maybe they were reminding him a little bit. So this text comes along. It's about 40 years old, and it was written by a person we really can't talk about opera seria without mentioning, and that is Pietro Metastasio, who lived in Vienna when Mozart moved there. He was elderly, infirm, he was revered, but also passé. So this text was presented to Mozart. It had been set many times before, and Mozart looked at it and said, oh, this isn't really very good. And so he relied on the collaboration of a Viennese court poet named Caterino Mazzola, and together, I believe that Mozart worked with this poet in creating this text. They had something that he could describe as a real opera. So there's a little bit of Metastasio, but there's much more Mazzola and probably some of Mozart in these words. Why is this important? Because the basic template or form for opera seria was pretty threadbare already. And I'm going to say something that's heretical. How many of you have gone to a Handel opera? We've done some of them here. Okay. They are long. And we always cut them. If we did them all, they'd be even longer. And they're usually basically a succession of what we would call the equivalent of dialogue. I'm going to get to that in a second. And then a solo aria, which presents the star singers of the day to strut their stuff and to make sure that the composer has written them solo arias that they like and that they can use. But dramatically, that doesn't add up to a really through telling of the story. And Mozart was a dramaturge as much as he was a composer. So I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to talk to you about what you can expect when you come into this story. A little bit. I think I'll talk a little bit first about the reception of it, or the conditions of its performance. The Magic Flute was a stunning success. And we know that Mozart conducted at least the first couple of performances. We know that Antonio Salieri went to it and bravoed, etc. So we all know historically that flute was a very great success. Now, Clemenza di Tito was also a success, a little bit more muted, because after all, it was presented at a coronation. And anybody who watched the more recent coronation, chorister, anyone who watched a more recent coronation knows there's a lot of stuff going on during those affairs. And the presentation of a new opera is only one of the things that's done. But Mozart had put it together very quickly. It's said that he actually wrote some of the works in his carriage on the way to Prague. That's a little bit like writing down like writing a letter or something on a plane experiencing severe turbulence, if you've ever imagined riding in a horse carriage. So I don't know if that's true or not, but he had to write it very quickly. You'll be amazed at how polished and how beautiful and how expressive this music is when you just consider that. And when it was first presented, it wasn't met with a great deal of enthusiasm, simply because there were too many other things going on. But during the course of its presentations and its performances in Prague, it seemed to excite a great deal of audience enthusiasm, so that Mozart could write, "It's the strangest thing," he wrote home, "but the same evening that my new opera, Flute, was given here in Vienna with such applause, Tito had its final performance in Prague, also with extraordinary applause." So it did have a following from the beginning, and as I'll tell you a little bit later, it was also revived quite a lot in the couple of decades after Mozart's death. So I'm now going to tell you what to expect with this. First of all, with any Mozart opera, we get a magnificent overture. And this one you can put up on the shelf right alongside Figaro's or Don Giovanni's or Magic Flutes. It's beautiful, beautiful music that showcases an orchestra that must have been pretty capable in Prague. And then we get to our first ingredient of an opera that's in Italian, and especially an opera seria like this, and that is recitativo. Now, usually when we produce these Mozart or 18th century operas, I do explain what recitativo is, so some of you may have heard me do that before. Would you like me to remind you what it is? Okay. First of all, there has to be dialogue so that we know what's happening in the plot. The arias generally are reflective. A character expresses an emotional reaction to what has happened in the plot up till that point. So the recitativo is like dialogue. And the composers will give pitches, they'll give notes to each syllable of the text, but the performer is expected to turn it into a speech-like rhythm, which is almost impossible to notate in Italian. So how many of you have been to Italy? Okay, so you know that they basically sing when they talk anyway in that country. And they can also communicate quite rapidly in that language. And so the recitative is a really efficient way to let us know what's going on, to watch interactions between characters. And the recitativo is divided into two types. The first thing you'll hear after the orchestra is a fairly long passage of recitativo secco, which means dry. And that is accompanied usually by harpsichord. This is the first time we've done this, but we're using a forte piano. Now that's just a convenient way of saying an 18th century piano. It's not a real instrument. I mean, it's not a real authentic old instrument because it's a piece of machinery and they just don't last. But it is a replica that was made in 1982 with the exact specifications, methodology, and materials as an instrument that was made in 1782. So you get to hear that, and you can see a little bit of a diagram of it over on the other lobby in the Touch Me table. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what is being done. Kimberly Bartzak, our principal coach, who trains the chorus, who plays for all the rehearsals, it's her responsibility to accompany these recitatives. All Mozart gave you are bass notes, and you have to work out what chords they are. Usually editors will have the chords, but you improvise all sorts of embellishments to match what's going on stage. And she's done this masterfully, but this is all her work. This is all improvised. So that's something that I think deserves an ovation. So that's recitativo secco. Now, there's recitativo accompagnato. That's reserved for something that's a pretty heightened dramatic part of the dialogue. And that's when the orchestra will, I was going to say accompany, it's more like punctuate what the characters are saying. Something like this. So a character might sing something like, my boyfriend has betrayed me with my sister, and now I'm going to avenge myself by killing both of them. And then she might think about it, and maybe I'm not doing the right thing. Oh, yes, I am. That sort of thing. And those sorts of emotions are frequently expressed in opera seria, it must be said. So then, of course, there will be arias. And Mozart always wrote that he needed to know who was going to sing a role before he could start composing the arias. He said that they had to fit the singer like a perfectly tailored gown or suit. So this performance this afternoon will give you a good idea of what kind of singers Mozart was writing for, with the exception that two of the male roles were sung, no, one of the male roles was sung by a castrato, and we don't use that voice type anymore, as far as we know. So that's generally taken by a female singer. So there are a couple of roles in this that are females playing males. We get used to that pretty easily, right? But what you'll get to hear is how Mozart wrote for singers with perfect breath control that could sing a very expressive, connected, smooth legato line, but also could deliver the agile fireworks and passage work necessary for what we often call coloratura. So he knew how to write for these expert singers, and they, of course, benefited from this. And Mozart being Mozart, he goes way beyond that, his writing for the character as well as the singer. So you get a real insight into how the characters are feeling and reacting to the situations around them, which are large situations. This is, after all, Roman history. So we'll get a number of arias, but what Mozart deplored in the tradition of opera seria was, first of all, the constant alternation between recitativo secco and aria. The character would walk on, deliver recitativo secco, sing an aria, and then walk off. And it's said that the audience would often just chatter and talk during the recitatives. You're not going to do that, right? What you're going to do is just watch the surtitles so you know what's being said. And a word about that too. Some people asked about this. Recitativo, whether secco or accompagnato, will have very little repetition of text. You don't do that when you're speaking. The arias, however, are now primarily musical. If the recitative is a dramatic medium, the aria really is a musical one first and foremost. And so therefore there's quite a lot of text repeating itself. And what we generally do is we allow you to understand what's being said in the surtitles, and then we don't keep putting them up over and over. So people asked why they went blank for some periods during the music. That's because they're just saying the same thing. Okay, good. Now, what Mozart did is create an opera seria with an unusual number of ensembles, duets and trios, etc. And in that, I think you have one of the richest sources of great operatic music in this work. So those are some of the things that you can expect as you watch it. I would advise you to read the plot synopsis, simply because it's not overly complex. It's not like Il Trovatore, where even if you do read the plot synopsis, you're likely to be bewildered. But just so that you know who's who. Now, I wanted to say a few things also about, I've got the reception, about what more or less happens at the beginning. You have a character named Vitellia. She's the first person that sings. And her music is very dramatic, whether it's in recit or aria. And she's a very powerful figure, but she's very jealous, and she has a very strong sense of her own importance. And she feels that she belongs on the throne. And she has heard that Tito is going to marry the woman he loves, named Berenice. We never meet her, but she's in love with Tito, and she thinks that she should be the one to be picked by Tito for his wife. So she gets Tito's best friend, who's named Sesto, to agree to go kill Tito, because that's what you do when you're Vitellia. And Sesto will agree, but then they find out that Tito is not going to marry Berenice after all, because the Roman public wants him to marry an actual Roman person. So he chooses one. And then it's revealed that she's in love with somebody else. And you do meet those people in quite a beautiful little sort of exchange. And so he backs off the idea of marrying her. But Vitellia has already sent Sesto off to do his dirty deed. And she doesn't know that, in fact, Tito is going to marry her. Now, we are always reminded at a certain point in any opera we watch that opera is not documentary. And there are a few of those occasions in this evening as well. But I want to play you a little bit of the aria that Sesto will sing as he says goodbye to Vitellia, with whom he is deeply in love, to go and off his best friend, Tito. This is called Parto Parto. And in it, we have a tremendous duet between Sesto and the clarinetist in the orchestra. Mozart had met and heard and admired a clarinetist named Anton Stadler, and he wrote his very final completed masterpiece, the Clarinet Concerto for Stadler. But he also brought him to Prague so he could play the clarinet parts. So in the first act, you're going to hear a duet with a regular B-flat clarinet. It was written for an instrument called the basset clarinet, but we don't have one. But the clarinet, almost to the last note, can execute the writing. So I'll just play a little bit of this music. Obviously, it starts very forcefully. And he says, there they are, orchestra players. And he says, I will leave, I will fulfill your mission. And then the music becomes more lyrical and more expressive, and the two artists, the soprano and the clarinetist, exchange passages like this. This is the singer, clarinetist. And some of it, even in the slow opening, can be really pretty demanding for the player. And so this actually accomplishes many things at the same time. It allows both the singer and the clarinetist to be showcased, as it were. But it also creates a greater depth of understanding of the character of Sesto as he's going about to take care of this business for Vitellia. And it also gives us an idea of Mozart's imaginative control over every single situation that is presented to him. Now, because this is an aria that's going to showcase both the singers, it's going to get fast as well. It's going to be virtuosic, singing on the clarinet as well as singing with the human voice. So here's some of the passage work you can look forward to hearing. Mm-hmm. And then she does it, or he does it. That was the singer, now it's the clarinet. Then they do it together. So it's a barn burner, that thing. It's meant to bring you to your feet with thunderous applause. But the other thing I'll just tell you about is a duet in the second act, the same character, but now the clarinet is something called a basset horn. And this one David does have, our principal clarinetist has an actual basset horn. It's lower than the normal run of clarinets, and you get a duet with that. So Mozart was actually showcasing one of the performers he most admired towards the end of his life. Now, one of the things that it seems like a thread running through so many of Mozart's works is the whole concept of forgiveness and redemption. Certainly that plays a really important part in Magic Flute, in Così fan tutte. It is at the center of Abduction from the Serraglio. And what more moving passage is there in all opera than the forgiveness that is extended towards the Count by his wronged wife, the Countess, at the end of Marriage of Figaro. So this is what this opera really is about. And the colossal determination of the title character, Tito, to forgive, to not rule by terror, to not rule by fear, to be benevolent, even if it is hurting himself. It is something that historians have had a little bit of difficulty coming to terms with. And this may explain, in fact, some of the reasons why Clemenza is not performed as much. However, 2007 saw this company produce another of Mozart's operas, Seria, Idomeneo. That was written by the composer before he moved to Vienna. And that one doesn't get done a lot either, but they're both worth it. Now, one thing that's very interesting about the post-Mozart life of Clemenza is that it got performed quite a lot, and it was because of one person, and that was Constanza, his widow. And if history has been a little bit dubious when it comes to outlining Mozart's life, it's been downright hostile to Constanza. She's often referred to as a rather flighty thing, fatuous, frivolous, not musical. And in fact, first of all, I'll tell you that it was she who ignited in Mozart an interest in the study of fugue. Has anybody ever learned one of those preludes and fugues by Bach? Or heard any of them? Airheads don't get attracted to fugues. So Constanza's love of fugue is enough already to make us understand she was a person of musical substance. She also was a singer of some accomplishment, and so she took the role of Vitellia in some of the posthumous productions of Clemenza. What ignited her interest in doing this was that the work had never been performed in Austria, only in Prague, and she wanted to make sure Vienna saw it. But then she toured it all the way to the end of the of the 18th century, and was determined to present it. Now, she needed to raise money. She needed to make money for her family. She had, she was friends with Mozart's assistant, whose name is Süssmayr, Franz Xavier Süssmayr, who she paid to finish the commissioned Requiem from Walsegg. And it's said that he had a hand also in writing some of Clemenza di Tito, simply because there's no secco recitative surviving in Mozart's own handwriting. So it's assumed that Süssmayr composed it. It doesn't matter, it's very good. But she did present these works, and it's baffled people why she would choose Clemenza di Tito instead of Don Giovanni, which was already absolutely catapulting into popularity. And I think it's because she liked the basic story, the basic theme of this work, the importance of forgiveness and redemption, and she wanted her husband to be remembered in that light. And so, by the way, Mozart's sister ended up living in Vienna, only a few blocks from Constanza, and they never saw each other because Mozart's sister didn't like Constanza at all. She didn't know her, but she didn't like her anyway. But her reputation should be fully redeemed by this point in history. So I want to thank you again for coming to hear me talk about this piece. I really think you're going to enjoy the opportunity to see and hear this production with these wonderful singers and the terrific orchestral playing. David's not the only one to get some great solos in this. And listen to the recitativo secco so you hear what's being done, not only for the new sound of the forte piano, but for the imaginative dexterity of Kim Bartzak. Have a great time at Clemenza. It's wonderful to see you at the beginning of our season, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the Little Prince. Take care. Thank you.